I think for some people it's complicated when you become an artist or when you make that designation. I mean, I grew up in a really small town. There weren't many artists around, no museums, no galleries. I come from a pretty modest background, so I knew I needed to make a living, and like, who makes a living making art, right? So I got a degree in geology and English, creative writing, which are both interests that have resurfaced and been fostered in my life for a long time. Some things I carry forward from that time are really this interest in maps, traces, the way in which we understand the land, and also a desire to be outside. I mean, so here, in college, I sought all these different ways to kind of make sense with what my future might be, as we all do. And one of them was like, oh, the geology department, they're always going on trips. They're always outside, with their rock hammers, like investigating crystal formations or thinking about geomorphology, sedimentology. Those things were very interesting to me. Never mind that, of course, I promptly graduated from college and told my parents I wasn't going to be a geologist. And I waited tables for a decade and worked in ceramic studios at Radcliffe and wrote poetry every morning. And it was an amazing time. You could survive on a restaurant wage really well. I had I don't know what well is. I had a tiny apartment in Cambridge on off of a parking lot. And hopped on my cycle and went into work at 4 and saw my friends there, but then was by myself in the day working on my artwork and writing. People are always trying to give you advice. Oftentimes what people need is not advice. They need someone to listen to what they're after and to support that. And I feel like I've been really lucky. I've had teachers who've done that for me, who've heard what I was after, maybe before I could hear myself, and supported me. And so I think, in part, that's what you're looking for. I think advice is challenging, right? Advice is someone telling you what to do. So for me, being able to teach is to share that love and to support people in coming to their own kind of vision. When I lived in Spain for 3 years, and during that time frame, I didn't teach. And I started making works that brought people together for these walks and these conversations and dialogues and sort of gatherings. And I think in large part, I sought out that connection with others through the work in a way that teaching also satisfies. I feel like walking for me is a sort of articulation of freedom, like a way of moving in my body that feels free. And I've always been a hiker and a walker and a traveler. I think I have a wanderer's mind, and a wanderer's personality. For me, walking is a really intimate way to understand your environment, to understand sight. I came to it through working site-specifically in gallery spaces and with projects, and then became very interested in sight in other ways. Of course, it relates back to geology research and growing up in the woods, the sense of understanding place through a kind of intimate engagement.
They say that years ago, how many no man knoweth, the river had 2 mouths by which it entered the ocean. 2 mouths opened, 2 kinds of speaking, 2 stories told. It is half the art of storytelling to keep the story free from explanation as one reproduces it. Space for the reader, I say. My mouth fills with sand. Time slips quietly into the place left for it, held in the palm of a hand.
I often work through a prompt or a kind of sense of sort of instruction or a kind of tool for thinking. So a recent piece I did in 2020 was called Polymest, and I've been really fortunate to work with Beverly Johnson, who's a geologist at Bates College, and she and I created the walk together, and she did a core sample in the Sprague River marshes. And so the prompt really was to think about our own body's time, our own body's relationship to archives and memory in relationship to the land and the land's archive and the land memory. So in doing a core sample, you can articulate, thousands. We have, like I have a picture in my hand with like 10,000 years of mud in it. You can understand a history much larger than us and longer than us, and to think about our human engagement with the planet in that way is humbling in an important way. And so partly it was a kind of way for us to think through our own sense of time, which of course is important to each one of us, but also our temporality in the scope of like the planet and the universe. I've worked with it in a lot of different ways to try to, sort of bring that immersive experience to a viewer, listener, walker, that there's a way in which you can enter into this other space. I think I've drawn alliances with scientists quite a lot. I mean, in part, of course, from my background. And yet we're utterly different, right? Our goals and the outcomes and the cultures within which we work. But there's some shared strategies that interest me. And so one thing I've thought a lot about is this notion of field work and data collection. I think of like when I studied geology, one aspect of geology is like breaking up the component parts and sitting at the microscope for like hours and hours and hours a day and seeing all those little amazing minerals and diatoms and like carbonaceous organisms that like make our soil and make the planet. But if you spend all your time looking that small and that close, you also lose something. So it's really about like that dialogue for me. And I think there's something about being on the planet and like standing on the earth that seems very important to how we understand our being, and that we don't often slow down. I mean, a thing about the walks is really I'm looking for a kind of slowing down of time where we can sense more. I think walking is like 3 or 4 miles an hour versus driving, and other forms of transport, flight. And so, what changes in terms of our perceptual acumen when we slow down? Quite a lot, I think. And so that's something that really interests me.
The other day, a friend said to me, "It's really best not to rush things." She spoke of time as if it were a spear thrust through the center of her body, one end pointing to the future and the other to the past. In my dream the other night, I told her I was searching for something I couldn't quite determine. But it didn't bother me, really. It seemed the search itself was the most important part. I was in a stranger's house in a great forest. I looked under seat cushions, in cabinets, drawers, within the covers of books. It isn't even clear to me if it was an object or a piece of paper I sought, an idea or an answer. But a certain temperament, an atmosphere of suspension, pervaded the dream. In the forest, my friend reflected, there are no visible horizons. They give way to the vertical signatures of trees. She said this in a desultory way, as if lacking direction. We were sitting in the sun on the cement steps to her apartment. The afternoon ticked by otherwise in silence. I thought, too, that we can understand our capacities in the slow wishes of forests, the stillness that compels in us a recognition of our greatest fears. Not so they drive us hastening toward invisible horizons, but so they compel us to attend to the vertical layers.
I've always been really interested in the fact that through two eyes, we see things at depth. I have an uncle who was a champion sulky driver, horse racer, if you know sulky driving, and he lost an eye when he was 3. And so everyone was always like, how is he doing it? Like, because he doesn't have the depth perception. And so I've always been interested in the different ways in which we understand depth. And one of those, of course, is like superposition, like something is behind something, then it's further away, and also scale shifts. And so, the thinking is that through these subtleties, he was able to understand depth. I mean, at a microsecond worth of time in like ultra proximity and danger, right? We were racing with these carts and the horses. And so through binocular vision, we are able to see the world in depth, in 3 dimensions. What's great about the stereoscope for me is that it does bring me back to this sense of handmade and childhood. It's not necessarily a technological process to achieve that depth. It's actually like me cutting out little pictures and shifting 1/8 of an inch this way and like seeing how it works. In my practice, I've always been juggling a lot of things, and I really have strong impulses to write as much as I do to make visual work. And so maybe there's something there about like wanting these things to come together somehow. I think, like it's at that moment of like play and experimenting and exploring and figuring out what that might mean. So I don't know. It's a question that continues in my work, is sort of like, how do these practices come together? Do they need to come together? Could there be 2 of me so I could do more? There's so much to do. There's never enough time. So when did I finally call myself an artist? It's kind of like the only thing I can do. You know what I mean? Like there's this moment where you realize all the other things you've tried to do don't fit.